Welcome to the Alyosha Society, friends. In this video, intended primarily for members of the Alyosha Society, I am going to be doing an introduction to our next study. I like to do that, especially if we're going to be getting into something fairly involved and deep and heavy and fun and awesome, like the study that we're going to be doing in fall of 2023, C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, also referred to as the Space Trilogy. But I think you're going to see by the time I get to the end of this video why, if there's one thing Lewis would not have wanted us to call it, it would be the Space Trilogy. So I'll refer to it as the Ransom Trilogy. I'm looking over my notes here, friends, and I've got a lot of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. A lot to cover. So let's get right to it. There he is, the man, the myth, the legend, C.S. Lewis's. So the three books, there they are: Out of the Silent Planet, Pearland of That Hideous Strength. I find this just a fascinating little tidbit. 1936, there you've got the arguably two greatest Christian literary giants of the 20th century. And they're hanging out, they're drinking a pint, of something probably pretty heavy, maybe a Guinness. C.S. Lewis was actually Irish, so maybe they were drinking a Guinness. They were sitting together and they were bemoaning the lack of quality science fiction literature. And as the story goes, they both agreed to a challenge that would be considered by a coin toss. They decided to flip a coin, and that one of them, based on the flip of the coin, would write a story. They were going to write some quality science fiction. One of them would write a story about space travel, and the other would write a story focusing on time. Up goes the coin, flipping and flopping around, each one of those men wondering, what in the world did I get myself into? And then, by the determination of that coin, the rest of the story. C.S. Lewis got space and wrote the Ransom Trilogy. J.R.R. Tolkien, his good friend, who actually led him to faith in Christ, got time. So let's just take a look at just the time period that we're looking at here. So the first of the books in this trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, written in 1938. The second one, written in 1943, Pearland, and then That Hideous Strength is written in 1945. Interesting, don't know that Lewis really planned it this way, but you've got one of them written right at the beginning of World War II, one of them written right smack dab in the middle of World War II, and then the third one written the last year of World War II. So C.S. Lewis is writing and publishing, and he's actually doing a lot more than these three books. We'll look at that in a minute. But during one of the darkest times, really, in Western culture. So let's take a real quick look then at this individual, Clive Staples Lewis. A lot of folks don't realize that he was not English. That is correct. He was not English. He was actually Irish. He was born a year of the Spanish-American War, 1898. He's born in Belfast. Sadly, his mother dies when he's 10 years old. 8 years after that, so when he's 18 years old, C.S. Lewis did something that changed his life. He read his first George MacDonald book. And George MacDonald, he would write later that George MacDonald was either the biggest influence in his life or one of the biggest influences in his life. So if you don't know who George MacDonald is, he was a 19th century writer of fantasy stories. And Lewis said, that, I think the quote is, he, quote, baptized my imagination. So remember, he's only 18 years old at this point. A year later, he enlists in the British Army and fought for 2 years in World War I. So he fought in World War I. He's going to do a lot of his writing during World War II and encouraging the nation with those BBC broadcasts, which later ended up becoming the book we now call Mere Christianity. But in 1925, so he's finished up his degrees. He's going to begin a very, very long teaching career. He teaches at Oxford for nearly 30 years. After 1954, he teaches at Cambridge. So no slouch. I mean, he's hanging out with, really some of the greatest thinkers on the planet, teaching at these two prestigious schools. But at that point, C.S. Lewis would have called himself an atheist. But something happened to him around 1930, 31. So that makes him, a 31, 32-year-old guy, super scholar, super smart guy. And he's an atheist teaching at the big universities. And his good friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, you know who Tolkien is. He wrote Lord of the Rings. He actually becomes a Christian. He becomes a believer in Jesus Christ. J.R.R. Tolkien was Roman Catholic. Lewis did not join the Roman Catholic Church. He became a part of the Anglican Church. So that is huge. So Lewis then takes this sharp wit, intellect, and knowledge of all things medieval, and then points those efforts toward writing books that have been a tremendous blessing to the Christian church ever since. A couple of years after that, you've probably heard of the literary group, the Inklings. It's a group of super smart, high-powered professors, authors, and artists who would basically just get together and talk about good art. What constitutes good writing? And C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were both a part of that very prestigious group. So again, just a reminder, so 1939 to 45, those are the years for World War II, and Lewis is doing his writing. There you go, there it is. Right during those years is when he's writing these books. Also, oh, by the way, I'll just crank out a few other Christian classics while I'm at it. 1941, he publishes the Screwtape Letters. And then I mentioned earlier, during this time, Lewis gave, I don't remember how many it was, but he gave a series of talks, the BBC radio talks, to the nation, trying to inspire them, encourage them during this dark time, fighting the evil Nazis. And those BBC radio talks were then sort of compiled and turned into the book that we now call Mere Christianity. Another, honestly, one of the great Christian classics of all time. He also happened to write The Great Divorce during the same time. So very, very productive time for C.S. Lewis. So 1950, you're probably more familiar, I'm guessing, with the Chronicles of Narnia, the 7 Narnia books. So he, the first of them was published later. So he wrote the Ransom Trilogy, roughly a decade before he writes Narnia, 1950. In 1956, so again, do the math. I'm thinking, whoa, he's a little bit older. Yes, he is. He's 58 years old, and he gets married. He was not married before this. And he married a woman named Joy Davidson. And sadly, and he writes about this in a couple of books, and it's pretty heartbreaking to read it, but she died only 4 years later, 1960. And C.S. Lewis died on a very, very remarkable day. Aldous Huxley, famous 20th century philosopher, died on that day. A lot of folks don't realize that, but what folks usually know about November the 22nd, 1963, is that is the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Texas. So C.S. Lewis died on the very same day. Now, okay, let me give my caveats here. I am going to be going over some fairly heavy philosophical and historical material. I am not doing it just for fun. I do enjoy it, but it is all tied into helping you better understand the Ransom Trilogy. So you're going to have to just trust me for now that this is completely tied in. I'll explain how later. But what I want to point out is that if you want to look at Western culture as a whole, like big picture, one way that you could divide, at least in terms of intellectual thought, okay, just in terms of thinking and philosophy, you could put the 18th century in there as a major dividing point, a major watershed moment, time period of Western society. So I'm going to use terms like Western culture, Western society. I might even say Western man. Okay, I don't mean just males. What I mean is, when I use those terms, I want you to know what I mean by that is really the general mindset of the Western world. And what we mean by that is primarily Europe and then the Americas. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. So what I'm going to point out to you here is that something happened in the 18th century. So that'd be the 1700s, of course. Something happened that completely, radically altered the way Western culture thinks, obtains truth, understands reality, the cosmos, the whole universe. And that is going to be the key to help you understand the Ransom Trilogy. So when we talk about the medieval mindset, it could also be the ancient world as well. But we're not as concerned about the ancient world here because, you know, pre-Christ, that's not a Christian society. And you'll see why that's not going to be as relevant to us here. But we're talking about the time period after the 18th century, which is what we call the age of the Enlightenment. All right. If it's been a while since you had that, you know, sophomore college class in philosophy or high school or whatever, and you don't, oh man, what was the Enlightenment? Okay. The Enlightenment was just a time period when Western culture started to make a huge shift in the way people thought about truth and reality. I could say it that way. It had a little bit to do with writings and the individuals of that time. It had a little bit to do with the scientific revolution. It had a lot to do with a lot of things. I'm not here to necessarily explain how it happened. What I'm here to do is tell you what happened. Okay, so before the 18th century, before the Enlightenment, Western man thought more in terms of the group, the body. So in other words, your identity would have been understood as being a part of a family or a tribe, or maybe even a culture or a nation in some way. So, okay, well, Bruce, how else would you think of yourself? Well, the way we think of ourselves today. We don't really think as much in terms of the body as we do, I am an individual. I am one single, I'm an island, sort of. I am this entity, and maybe it doesn't or doesn't matter if I'm a part of some body. So the medieval mindset is more of a corporate way of thinking about your identity. But after the Enlightenment, we start having much more of an individualistic mindset. Now, medieval man, how does he think about truth? Well, when medieval man thought about the big questions of life, you know, how did we get here? Who are we? Is there a God? What's going to happen to me when I die? When medieval man thought about those questions, he immediately went to the Bible. Now, let me clarify one thing here. When I say medieval man, I don't mean every single individual. I mean the culture as a whole, the majority. Okay, I'm not talking about the outliers and, you know, the exceptions to the rule. I'm talking about this is generally the way people thought. They would go to the Bible, and the Bible would answer the questions. How did we get here? Is there a God? What's going to happen to me when I die? The Enlightenment changes that. Huge shift here. The Enlightenment starts to think, well, wait a second. We have all these, you know, new scientific discoveries, the scientific method, logic, reason. Maybe we don't need to just explain everything away using, you know, mysticism and gods and you know, these spiritual. We understand it all now by science. Ooh, that's a huge shift, guys. That is a ginormous change in the way Western man thinks. So what you might, another way of saying it is you might say medieval man was more mystical and enchanted. Now, you know, time out. I don't mean like witchcraft or anything weird. I just mean that Western man believed in a spiritual reality, that there is a realm and it is real. It's even more real than the world that we can see with our eyes. But we can't see this world, but it exists. Okay, that's what you might call an enchanted mindset, a mystical, a spiritual mindset. Enlightenment man says, you know what? I don't know. Maybe not. I mean, we seem to be able to explain everything simply by using the scientific method. So maybe the material world is all there is. That's what you'd call an unenchanted worldview. Guys, going from an enchanted worldview to an unenchanted worldview is a Grand Canyon leap. Next, so medieval man was sacramental. He recognized that there's a God who dispenses grace. He believed in the sacred versus the profane. He had a worldview that was, if you want to, you know, be fancy pants at parties, drop words like theocentric. Okay, that just means God-centered. It was a God-centered worldview. But Enlightenment thinker, when I say Enlightenment thinkers, who am I talking about? Well, the French, you know, Voltaire is probably one of the most famous. You probably heard the name Voltaire. But to be honest with you, there are probably a few other names that you're more familiar with. Some of the founding fathers were Enlightenment thinkers. Probably Thomas Jefferson and, you know, maybe Benjamin Franklin. Some of those guys were very much Enlightenment thinkers and were a part of this shift. So as opposed to being theocentric, okay, Western man now becomes secular, not sacred and sacramental anymore, but humanistic as opposed to theocentric. So man-centered instead of God-centered. So when it comes to authority, so who has a say in how I live my life? Medieval man would have said, well, there might be a lot of individuals and groups that have a say, but definitely the church. The church has real authority. Not after the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment starts to push back on that and say, why should the church have any authority in your life? Okay, we're gonna explain everything using our common sense, our reason, and science. Why would we need the church to have any authority in our lives? Science is the ultimate authority. Now, to wrap this part of it up, I want to just use a couple of fancy pants Latin expressions here that show the difference between the two, I think, very nice. Let me just go ahead and put them both up there. So medieval man would have agreed with the expression credo ut intelligam. Credo ut intelligam, what does that mean? Well, translation, I believe in order that I might understand. All right, now that order is important. So I believe there's a God. I believe the Bible's true. I can't explain it all, but I'm going to study and I'm going to read with faith to understand it better, but I'm going to start with belief. That is huge, because the Enlightenment comes along and says, no, 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 we have to reverse that. No, no, no. Intelligo ut credam. You see, I have to understand, so that the translation will be, I understand in order that I might believe. Guys, that is again, a tectonic shift philosophically and theologically. So I have to understand it before I will believe it. There has to be proof and evidence, preferably scientific proof, or I'm not going to believe it. Now you say, well, Bruce, that's just the way people, I know. I know that is exactly the way Western man thinks today. But that is not the way Western man used to think. Now, guys, look at everything on the right-hand side of this screen. That is essentially the way our culture thinks today. Individualistic. I mean, science is definitely reigning supreme. Boy, oh, if you know, ooh, follow the science. I mean, what did you hear during COVID? Follow the science, follow the science, follow the science. You know, science is on this, you know, giant throne. If science says it, then, well, that just shuts down all argument. It's a material world, and what you can see is all there is. Secular, humanistic world. Now, what does this have to do with the Space Trilogy? Okay, shift myself around here. All right, here's a timeline. All right, take a look at the timeline. I have the medieval time period, which, by the way, I should have told you earlier, but if you need some dates for that, roughly, okay, guys, I'm just ballparking here. Let's just call it AD 500. So 500 years, basically, after the birth of Christ, until, I'm just going to say, the beginning of the 18th century to about 1700. That's what we would call the medieval era. And then the Enlightenment is sort of slowly already kind of taking root and growing, and it'll just grow and grow and grow from there. Now, you have C.S. Lewis, who's living right here in the 20th century. And we would call this modern man. It's not medieval man anymore, because it's post-Enlightenment. Remember, everything on the right-hand side of the screen from the former slide. C.S. Lewis is living in this world that has largely abandoned a biblical way of thinking about the cosmos, the universe, reality, truth, and so forth. So what does C.S. Lewis do? All right. C.S. Lewis, remember, after 1931, he's a Christian now. So he's thinking to himself, so how do you communicate the gospel in this setting, which is pretty hostile to the gospel? Ooh, make a rap about that. Hostile to the gospel. I won't do that. So he's thinking, and then, okay, this is it right here. C.S. Lewis is thinking to himself, I got it. I am going to write a story that is futuristic. It's going to kind of look like the Jetsons. Okay, sorry. That's an old cartoon we used to watch back in the 70s. But it was about the future. It's about, you know, flying cars and stuff. I'm going to write a story that is about interplanetary travel and all this. But that's not really the goal. What I'm really doing, Lewis says, is I'm going to use this sci-fi story to actually highlight the value of the medieval mindset, which is a Christian worldview. So you see that. And he writes the Space Trilogy, also known as the Ransom Trilogy. He says, okay, my trilogy is going to focus on the future because, again, we're going to be traveling to planets, Mars and Venus, to be specific. That's what happens. But what he's really trying to do is to draw our attention back to everything on the left-hand side of that screen that had the worldview, you know, the 18th century in the middle. He wants to draw our attention back and say, guys, this is a biblical worldview over here, and that's the way we should be thinking. All right, now let me just I'm gonna throw it right back to you, just as a reminder. I'm not gonna walk back through it again, I promise. You think, oh, wait a second. Now this is starting to make more sense, but I don't remember all that stuff. All right. I'll put it back up for you. Lewis is living in a world characterized by everything on the right-hand side of the screen. But he's saying, he's trying to communicate in his story that we need to think in the way that's consistent with everything on the left-hand side of the screen. We need to understand that the true reality is a mystical reality, that God has revealed himself in his word, that he has established his church, and that Christ is the head of that church, and that we can have faith in him, and we can work out and figure out the details along the way, but we believe and we know with the eyes of faith. Credo ut telego. All right. Now, I knew this video was going to get a little bit long, so, take a bathroom break, pause me, do whatever you got to do. But this is really important now. C.S. Lewis is thinking back to the medieval cosmology, to the way that medieval man thought the universe existed. Now, this is not literally, this is not what the universe looks like. We know this. Our solar system does not look like this. C.S. Lewis knew that. What he's doing is he's recreating the medieval cosmology in order to point out the theological and spiritual truths that were embraced during this time. So let's take a look. What was that cosmology? What did people believe? Let's say, 1,000 years ago. Let's just say 1,000 years ago, maybe 1,500 years ago. What did Western man believe about the heavens? Well, take a look. It's a little bit like, I actually have one, but I don't want to do it. You know those Russian nesting dolls? Where you have like a little teeny, you have like a doll within a doll within a doll within a doll, and it's kind of like that. If you look at the picture here, with Earth being the tiniest and at the center of it all. So this is what we would call a geocentric, system. The Earth is at the middle. The next thing out from the Earth is the moon. Okay, we know that. And then beyond the moon, it goes in this order: Mercury, Venus, then the sun. I know. Just hang with me. I know that's not the way it is, but just then beyond the realm or the sphere of the sun, you have Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then the stars from there on. So you might call this the seven heavens or the heavens, starting with moon and beyond. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, why is this important? Well, medieval man believed that the Earth is a fallen planet. All right, we still believe that. Christians believe that. We are affected by the fall. Adam eats the fruit, he disobeys God, mankind falls. You know that story. But here's the thing: the rest of the heavens are not affected by the fall. So if you notice, when you look at the structure like this, you see that the moon is directly outside of Earth. So that means we would say we're in what's called the sublunar realm. Sublunar, literally under the moon. So everything in the sublunar realm is fallen. But everything in what's called the translunar or beyond the moon, look at this, not fallen. Pre-fall. It's like the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve sinned. And that would be from Mercury and beyond, all not fallen. Okay, so when we're going to be reading our books, and human beings from Earth are traveling to these other planets. They're encountering beings that are not fallen. That is really, really, really important in understanding the Ransom Trilogy. So a few more details. So again, the Earth is at the center, and you have the 7 spheres, like the nesting dolls. I already showed you that. Now, each sphere is ruled by the planet that is fixed within that particular sphere. Everything in the sublunar realm is fallen, as I said. Everything in the translunar realm is not fallen. And medieval man believed that. The heavens, so if everything from Mercury and beyond is not fallen, then there's a sense in which, look, whether you take this literally or figuratively, again, it doesn't matter. There's a sense in which the heavens are declaring the handiwork of God. The heavens are singing the praises of the Creator. There's joy. There's symbolically or otherwise, there's dancing, there's singing, there's praise to God, because those realms are not fallen. But everything in the sublunar realm is silent, because we are not ruled by one of the angels of God. We are ruled by an angel, but it's a fallen angel called the Bent One. So the Earth is the silent planet. And that'll explain the title of the first book, Out of the Silent Planet. Well, what's the silent planet? Earth is the silent planet, because we are the only sphere or realm that is fallen. So we are not, in a global sense, we are not singing the praises of the true and living God. Now, this is huge right here. In the Ransom Trilogy, again, this is Lewis, who is using the medieval cosmology and putting his own fictional twist on it to communicate truths that are absolutely positively real and true. You got to get all that. So in the Ransom Trilogy, each planet, remember, not fallen, Mercury, Mars, Venus, so forth, each planet is ruled by an angel, or as the word he uses in the trilogy is an Eldil. Eldil. So when you come across the word Eldil, that's one of the angels that's ruling one of the spheres. And Earth is ruled by the Bent One, and that's why we're silent and they're not. The Bent One, of course, Lucifer. A very good book I read recently by a lady named Christiana Hale about the Ransom Trilogy. She says, in the medieval period, the concept of space, this is why we can't call it the Space Trilogy. Okay, and I'm not trying to be like a literary snob or something. This is why. In the medieval time period, this idea that everything out there beyond the atmosphere of the Earth is this wild black expanse of darkness and silence would have never entered into the mind or the imagination of medieval man, and definitely not his literature. Medieval man, again, I'm not here to get into details. Literally, figuratively, symbolically, I don't know, and I don't care. Medieval man would have viewed that realm as a realm that was alive, vibrant, thriving world of perfection, unaffected by the fall. So this idea of just dead, dark, void, space, that the way we tend to think of, the universe, just not the way medieval man thought about it. So again, Lewis is not aiming at scientific accuracy here. He knows the truth about the science. He's communicating theological truth. So one more thing, and I'll wrap this up. In the medieval perspective, the planets not only had these spheres, they were not only not fallen, but they were understood to have particular personalities. They had characteristics. They weren't just dead, lifeless matter. You know, what do you mean, Bruce? I mean, Mars has a personality? Yes, absolutely. So the Romans, even, good grief, the Romans, I think, were closer to the truth than many people today. The Romans named them. We don't know who exactly named the planets, but the Romans named them after their gods. Okay, if you didn't know this, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, those are all names for the Roman gods. So the Romans even believed that they had some kind of distinct personality aspect. So let me show you what that looks like. I don't want to go over this whole chart. You can take a screenshot or pause it or do whatever you want. But again, this would be the seven heavens here, starting with the moon and going to Saturn. The moon, also called Luna. The characteristics of the moon: watery, damp. It was viewed as the barrier. So the moon is really important to medieval man, because the moon is the dividing line between fallenness and unfallenness. And it was believed that the moon could even impact your thinking and the wanderings of your mind. This is where we get the word lunacy. Mercury. Mercury is the Usain Bolt of the planets. He also called Hermes, if you're more familiar with the Greek gods. He was the messenger guy. You know, he's the one with the wings, you know, on his tennis shoes. You know, he was fast, nimble, eager, skilled. So yeah, Mercury is associated with speed and delivering message. Venus, come on, you know, Venus, this is Aphrodite, you know, the Greeks. Venus is the goddess of beauty and love, also called Fortuna Minor. Fortuna, fortune, or goodness, or benevolence, but not the most benevolent. There's one more that's more benevolent, that can bring you more good. But Venus is, all right, Venus is second place. So that's pretty good. Venus is the archetypal mother. So anything associated with giving birth, creating, fertility, that's Venus. Soul, or sun. The sun god was Apollo. So when you think of Apollo, you know, you remember the priest of Apollo or the priestess of Apollo was always associated with telling the future and giving prophecies. So Apollo was associated with ideas, thinking, philosophy, wisdom. Okay, Mars. Now, Mars is going to be important because that's where we're going to go in the first book. It's not called Mars. I'll show you what it's called in a minute. Mars is the god of war. You know this. So Mars is associated with power, strength, courage. Jupiter. Jupiter's the king. Jupiter's the largest planet. Jupiter is Fortuna Major, who can give you the most fortune. He can bring you the most good. Everybody likes to have a jovial spirit. Jove is just like a nickname or a shortened version of Jupiter. You hear people say, well, by Jove, I think he's got it. I guess the British say that. Jove is just another name for Jupiter. Saturn. Ooh. Jupiter good, Saturn bad. Saturn is in Fortuna Major, the most misfortune or unfortunate. Saturn can bring death into your life. Saturn can bring sadness, sickness, old age, fatal accidents, pestilence. I mean, Saturn is always, so Saturn, if just to go back to your Greco-Roman mythology, is also Kronos to the Greeks. And Saturn, so Saturn's the father of the Olympian gods, you know, Jupiter and so forth. One of the Titans. Okay. Now, how does that tie into our books? Okay. We'll start with Out of the Silent Planet is going to focus on Mars. We're going to go, but it's not called Mars, it's called Malacandra. So when you see Malacandra, that's Mars, and you go back to the characteristics, that means this story is going to highlight those martial characteristics, if that makes sense. And I'm going to go back to them in a second. The second book in the trilogy, Paralandra, we're going to go to Venus. The interplanetary travel is going to take us to Venus, but it's not called Venus. It's called Paralandra. So the book is just named after the planet. And once again, not affected by the fall. So, males and females who are living on Paralandra are like Adam and Eve before the fall. Characteristics, I'll go back to them. And then finally, the third book in our trilogy, That Hideous Strength, is going to focus on the king of the planets, Jove or Jupiter. Now, let's put it all together, and I'm going to wrap this puppy up a little bit. If you look what I have in red, number 1, Out of the Silent Planet, we're going to focus on Mars, and those are the characteristics that medieval man believed about this planet. Once again, the planets, the heavens, the spheres, they're not just dead matter. There's some sense in which they're living. And they at least exude or represent these characteristics. Number 2, Paralandra, Venus, birth, fertility, fortune, good luck, archetypal mother. And then finally, Jupiter, the greatest good, king of the planet, Fortuna Major. Now, I promise I'm wrapping it up right now. The teacher in me says, wow, I just flung a lot of content at you. The teacher in me says, I need to end by basically bringing it all together in one simple, concise statement. The purpose of C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy is to use a story involving interplanetary travel in order to draw modern man back to an enchanted or medieval, essentially Christian, worldview and cosmology, view of the universe, and by doing so, to communicate the gospel. If you made it to the end of this video, you should send me an email so I can just send you a smiley face. No, seriously, I'm not even kidding. Bruce@AlyoshaSociety.com. If you made it to the end of this video, then you just plowed through a massive amount of content. I hope it's been helpful. I'm looking forward. September the 5th, 2023 is when we're going to begin our study of the Ransom Trilogy. I hope this video has been helpful to get you into reading the books. And I also hope to see you at the Alyosha Society during our book club studies, which meet every Tuesday or Thursday evening, beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Check out the details on the website, AlyoshaSociety.com. Take care.